So I'm going to kind of lead on from Nikos about how we increase deceased donors for our paediatric recipients. So I think a lot of it, we have to think about what information, we've talked a little bit about the media and the social media today, and it's obviously becoming more into the fray. I'm going to touch a little bit upon neonatal and infantile donation, which is something which has been in the heart of transplantation, but also, again, in the media, but with especially looking at how we can increase, and then talk a little bit about utilization, because I think we have a lot about transplantation. I don't have enough time, but we've published some work on declined organs, and Nizam and I were at a meeting in Pan London last week. We were looking at the number of declined offers that happens, and then obviously thinking of outside the box of the ways that we can increase the donor pool. So I always love it when we have campaigns. It makes you think back to basics, and with Kidney Research UK, they're very much into thinking about transplantation, putting it more on the agenda, but especially, as you can see here, the number of people waiting transplantation, kidney transplantation, remains at the top. You've already seen the slide, but basically it shows you the number of adults on the waiting list is beginning to go down. So I guess when we look at what we were setting out with Lisa Burnap, who heads living donor transplantation, but also looking at campaigns for 2020, we wanted there to be less people waiting for a transplant, but also less people dying waiting a transplantation as well. And what can we say about children? Well, you could be positive or negative. Is your glass half full or half empty? Because what you could say is actually, well, we're doing really well and it's decreased over the last decade. But in addition, what you can also say is that it seems to have gone up a little bit recently in the last 12 months. And although we've changed the kidney offering scheme in the United Kingdom this year, one thing that happened is actually the waiting list time for transplantation for children went up for the first time this year prior to the change in the kidney offering scheme. So I keep on telling NHS Blood and Transplant, when they tell us how much better it is now with the new kidney offering scheme, it's got to be in context that this year it went up. But what we can see is there's a lot of variation, and that's one of the areas that we're interested in researching. Why do things happen differently in different centres? And it may be not only the infrastructure and the number of members, for example, of the nursing team working in transplantation, but it may be a difference in the mindset of the multi-professionals within the team. I haven't given you the actual names of the units here, but I just wanted to show you that if you looked at the median waiting time in the United Kingdom for children, it varies from 114 to 498 days. So that means that in some units, the average time is about 3 months, but in other units, it is heading up for 1.5 years. So there is a complete variation what is happening up and down the country. Sometimes I'm told that that's because of ethnicity, but I think everybody would agree in London we have a multi-ethnic population. There is obviously changes in gender variation as well. It's sometimes depending on your baseline, the number of children that you have with posterior urethral valves at any given time if you've got few numbers of children in your units. So what can we actually do? And I think one of the important things is we can't do anything alone. We need to work together as a multi-professional team. So one of the first things to discuss is the Max and Kira's law. So this is looking at the opt-in and opt-out system. So the idea about starting the opt-out happened in Wales as a test. As you can see here, the 1st of December 2015, and it is likely NHS Blood and Transplant, together with the Department of Health, it's looking like the beginning of April 2020 will have the opt-out system in England. That is where it is deemed that you are presumed to be wanting to donate your organs after you die. So at the moment you need to be registered, which of course you can have whenever you have a new driving license, for example, in the United Kingdom. If you go to Boots and you get your Advantage card, you have to tell them whether you want to be a deceased donor. So there are various ways of actually doing this. I'm going to touch a little bit about Scotland. My Scottish colleagues at the back, Scotland are always ahead of the game, because in Scotland you can decide at age 12 that you want to be a deceased donor without the consent of your parents. You can make that decision yourself. Whether it happens, of course, is the whole big debate about opting out, taking in England. So obviously we need to think about the parental rights and the rights of minors. We obviously want to do what is right for children, and we touched a little bit upon that in the ethics. So with a living donor, there is a discussion, should children ever be living donors? And this has been debated. This was 13 years ago, this editorial that I wrote, when I actually looked around the world, and every country had minors under the age of 18 who had donated their organs as living donors, and the UK was included as well. But what can we think about for deceased donation, donation after brain death and donation after circulatory death? Well, I think a lot of it goes back to education and about speaking to the public. And one of the things which has come on is actually the Scottish educational system. So in Scotland, it is part of the natural curriculum that teachers have to educate the children about transplantation and about deceased donation, and also they talk about live donation. And that education program has actually resulted in children going home and having the conversation with their parents, and making parents think about what their views might be on transplantation and organ donation. So it's not allowed nowadays, I think, in 2019 to say you're unaware, because the information is out there and we've got to make sure that we talk about donation. So we touched a little bit about the Live Life, Give Life, but this was a YouGov poll that they did, which I thought I would share with you. And it was in 4,227 adults, of which nearly 1,000 were parents who had children under 18. And what they wanted to do was to get their attitudes to organ donation. So talking about, would you consider being a deceased donor? Would you consider this as a child? And would you consider as an adult? And what you can see here is that in Scotland, 55% would feel comfortable discussing organ donation with their children, whereas in Wales it was about a third. And remember, as I said, Wales started with the opt-out campaign. You might be able to see where you live, but London was down at 24%. Everybody thinks we're forward-thinking in London. That's only because Nizam and I are the Scots living here trying to show you what to do. So what are the attitudes to organ donation from parents? Well, what some people think is that children are too young and too vulnerable to be talking about dying and death, and also about transplantation. It's quite a difficult concept. And of course, we're not talking about saying it to 4- and 5-year-olds, we're talking about secondary school education. And some people feel they don't want to upset their children, or they would not avoid talking about it at all. And that was 43%, so that quite surprised the number of people. What if mummy and daddy died? What would you want to happen? It's also a difficult subject. As a growing child, you don't want to consider your parents, the fact that they are not immortal. And discussing organ donation with family members, as you can see here, 2 out of 5 felt it was inappropriate to discuss it with an immediate family member. So if we don't talk about organ donation and who holds a deceased donor card, and thinking about what we're going to do with the opt-out system, then we really need to rethink and revisit. And obviously we can talk about what happens in your various centres, but also your countries as well. But you can see here that about 2 in 5 felt that they were able to talk about it with their spouse or partner, but only, as you can see here, about 1 in 6 with their children. So one of the other aspects I wanted to look at was the consent and authorization rates for deceased donation. So this was over the 4 years. And as you can see, that the consent authorization rates is obviously less for DCD compared to DBD, but is actually pretty similar in the DBD between adults and pediatrics. If you want to look at the mean number of organs transplanted per donor age group, that you can see that for a healthy pediatric DBDs, you can see that the number of organs transplanted is 4.5. So actually, it is up to the intensive carers and it's up to the SNOD teams to really think about donation in these groups of children as well. And what we have seen is there has been an increase in the number reported by NHS Blood and Transplant over the last 5 to 10 years. What has come up more recently is talking about neonatal and infantile donation. Again, it seems so wrong to think about children dying. We talked about the ethics of our own patients, but also to think about giving life back after your child has died. And that is something which is increasing, as you can see, in infantile donors under 6 months, which has increased over the last 6 years. So what about the actual utilization? And I put the question here, is there an issue with identification of potential pediatric donors, and what are the consent rates? What actually happens in the situation? And this was looking at some work which was done by Richard Hodge for NHS Blood and Transplant, with a number of extra pediatric donors that could result each year if they used the same criteria that were used for adults. And what you can see here is that the total number of DBD and DCD increased by nearly doubling of the numbers that they had previously. And the number of extra transplants that could result each year if they use the same thing with adults, again, the total number increased was nearly 90 to 100 every single year. So we're talking about substantial number of organs being available if we applied the same criteria to children. If we want to look specifically at the younger pediatric donors, so the under 2s, and there's a whole big debate, we use the cutoff of 2 because, for example, in renal transplantation, you're likely to take them en bloc, and then there's a consideration whether they go into adult, so kind of young adults, or whether you would consider them in some of your adolescents. And I think it depends on the patient, if they're sensitized, if they're on dialysis, how long they've been waiting for a kidney. And you can see here that the number of organs donated has increased exponentially year on year. And you can see that with the groups above the age of 2, there has been an increase, but not to the same amount. And you can see the number of kidney transplants in 6 to 18 years is normally around about 100. What about if you look at the outcomes from these transplants? Well, the donors aged 0 to 2 generally do a little bit less favourably, although sometimes actually you can have improved EGFR by having en bloc kidneys put in, obviously, and that's one thing which is looked at, but there's an increased thrombotic rate, and these patients do need anticoagulation, which is usually more than your standard. And if you look at the renal transplants from the pediatric deceased donors, if you have a look, there wasn't any difference in the groups that when it was published in Transplantation back in 2015. So what's the way forward? Well, I think we need to recognise there's a potential that we can increase the number of paediatric deceased donation that happens. There's a big working group, the NODT, through the National Health Service Blood and Transplant, is looking at this with guidance with neonatologists and intensivists, together with the SNOD teams and nephrology and transplant surgery, as well as the multi-organ. There has been some innovation in the Leeds group, where Niaz Ahmed, who started there, did some of the initial transplants and the very small and the neonates and infants that went in the press, and it's now been deemed that we would also do them in London with the Guy's transplant surgeons, and obviously working in the teams with Evelina and Gosh. So I think one of the things that came up was that we need to have specialist small paediatric donor kidney transplant units, and not everybody should be putting small kidneys into even adults around the country, and it should be done by a specialised group. I'm just going to end very briefly with thinking outside the box. You've heard about ABO-incompatible living related. What about doing ABO-incompatible deceased donor transplantation? And part of the issue is that the antibody titers vary hugely from lab to lab. And Nick Barnett, who's now here at Guy's, when he was doing his research, he looked at some of the data, and what we did is we looked at all of our patients who were on hemodialysis, who were waiting on call, and we looked at the titers. And what we found is that a third of our patients who were on call for deceased donor transplantation had antibody titers of 1 in 8 or lower. So that means that 1 in 3 patients, if you remember from Nikos's slide, wouldn't require any additional immunosuppression if they were called for a blood group incompatible deceased donor renal transplantation. 1 in 6 of them had a teacher of 1 in 16 and below, so that means a total of nearly a half of them would be very easy to do pre-transplantation. And with NHSBT, we did some modelling, and we found that this would increase the transplant activity by about 2%, and the median time would be reduced by about 20 days. So to conclude, I think there's increasing recognition that there are some missed opportunities in paediatric organ donation. I think we need to think about increasing the organ utilization, and maybe for adult recipients as well in the under 5s. But we have good outcomes after using these kidneys, and there's ongoing challenges for the PICU and transplant communities, and we have a duty to provide end-of-life options to parents and families. Obviously, I'd like to thank Live Life, Give Life, who gave some of the data that I presented, also NHSBT, but also our teams, NIAS and the surgeons and members of the CAG. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, again for another excellent lecture. Any questions for Steve on this topic or any other topic? I'm sure he can answer a question.
Does anybody want to give some of their experience, Antonia? Your experience of using young deceased donors? What's the policy in your unit and with Eurotransplant?
Our donor issue is just changed in the Netherlands. So we have the opt-out system. So we have to look if that will come into more transplantations. But I think we didn't change in children as donor. So I think that the numbers remain stable during the years. But once in a while we have a child as a. That's what I often hear from parents later on. So, for example, last year we had a child who died from asthma when she was skiing, and the parents decided to not go for donation. But later, they really felt sorry, but you were not. They told us that you were not well enough informed. So I think we have to improve the information to the parents when this moment comes, and then we can improve donation in children. That's what I think would be important.
Yeah. Just a comment on your showing the programs for education in schools. In the Netherlands, since 5 or 6 years, we have quite a comprehensive program for donor education in secondary schools. It is not compulsory, but it is now taken up by the majority of secondary schools. The idea is not to promote donation or to say you have to donate, but to give all the basic information about what is happening, what is donation, what is transplantation, and to teach the pupils to make up their own minds. And this has resulted, and there's now research done, in a considerable rise in the number of young adults who sign up as donors in the register as positive as donors. And we have, it's really, let's say, an increase compared to, let's say, 5, 6 years ago. So having these programs really makes sense. And as you say, they take it back to home, to the kitchen table, discuss it with the parents. We'll have to see if that works, but for the young ones, it certainly works. And we have now also a pilot program to discuss organ donation and transplantation, even in primary schools. And you'll be surprised at, let's say, how 6, 7, 8-year-olds grasp the idea of donation. And very naturally they say, well, there is a solidarity element. If you want something, you also have to give something. So that idea becomes very central in let's say, informing your own opinion about it. So it is really, I think, a very important issue, education, to make people, let's say, accept donation. Let's say from the age of 18 in the Netherlands, you're officially allowed to register as a donor. It can be even from 12 years old, so as in Scotland. Yeah.
But what is difficult is that when you want to be a donor, that the system is now that the family can decide to refuse. So also in the jail, but also in adults. So, I mean, when I die and I want to be a donor, but my family thinks, oh no, we are not going to do it.
Well, this was the whole
That's
big
difficult.
debate. The whole
Yeah.
big debate here in England as well is that it's never deemed anything in law, and if somebody's relatives turn around and say they don't want it. And one of the issues has been that Wales, there wasn't an increase in the uptake, and it's only just been shown now that there is an increase in the total numbers by having the opt-out system.
I think this is probably the most important thing we can do for transplantation is increase donors. No question about it. But one of the important things is that we need to validate the first person consent. In the United States right now, first person consent trumps everything. If the family is not agreeable, we give a cooling down time and we go ahead and say this is like a living will and it's honored. Because if not, it's no sense to have it. Second thing is that in our area we have a special registry for small pediatric donors for pediatric patients first. And if you see the UNOS declarations,
Yes.
the front page, children, donor for children recipients, and that's not happening. So we are appealing to that to make it happen. I tell you, if we can increase that, a lot of this that we use in our live donor could be solved with a better with pediatric donors.
I mean, it has been debated in NHSBT, but it's not paediatric donors for paediatric recipients in the UK where it is in Eurotransplant.
I think in the UK there's very good reasons as to why
Yeah.
we have consent from families. If the families say no, then actually we don't take the organs because I think the public relations element of taking someone's organs without your family's consent actually would probably do quite a lot of harm in the media, etc. But I guess I had a question about the practicalities of educating young children about organ donation. I have a number of young children, and despite being a transplant surgeon, I feel very uncomfortable at the thought of my children being donors. And my children, when I've talked to them about it, initiated by them, Daddy, what do you do? Is it true that you take organs from someone and give it to someone else that needs it? They don't understand what I'm talking about. I can see a total blankness in their face. And I just don't know how informed paediatric consent to donate can really be.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of it is doing things in an age-appropriate manner. Transplant TV Live and NHSBT have got some wonderful interviews that they've put online, some of which include children, but also looking at parents. And some of them, you know, parents, as Antonio was saying, somebody who's relatively healthy with asthma then dying suddenly, or a child having a road traffic accident. But what it gives back to families when they hear that it saved, you know, 5 other people's lives, it does mean a lot. And the connection that they then have that their child is living on is also, I think, a powerful medium as well.